Tonight, the long-awaited report by special counsel Robert Hur concludes that no criminal charges against President Biden are warranted. But the investigation uncovered evidence that President Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen, including marked classified documents about Afghanistan and notebooks with sensitive intelligence sources and methods, which he shared with a ghostwriter. The report says that posed serious risks to national security. And at a time when polls show most Americans have concerns about the 81-year-old president's mental and physical health, the special counsel's report offers scathing details of what it calls his diminished faculties and faulty memory. Writing, if charged, Mr. Biden will likely present himself to the jury, as he did during his interview with our office, as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. It would be difficult to convince a jury they should convict him. According to the report, Mr. Biden did not remember when he was vice president, forgetting on the first day of the interview when his term ended, and forgetting on the second day of the interview when his term began. He did not remember, even within several years, when his son Beau died.
How in the hell dare he raise that? Frankly, when I was asked the question, I thought to myself, it wasn't any of their damn business. I don't need anyone to remind me when he passed away or passed away.
Later in the press conference, President Biden referring to the president of Egypt as the president of Mexico.
As you know, initially, the president of Mexico, Sisi, did not want to open up the gate to allow humanitarian material to get in.
The extraordinary circumstances here require the appointment of a special counsel.
Attorney General Merrick Garland appointed the special counsel in January of last year, after President Biden's attorneys first discovered classified documents at one of his former offices on November 2, 2022. The White House waited until after the midterm elections to tell the public. And the report includes these photos of where prosecutors say more classified documents were improperly stored in a badly damaged box near a collapsed dog crate in Mr. Biden's Delaware garage. A separate special counsel investigated former President Trump for allegedly mishandling classified documents found at his Mar-a-Lago estate. Some boxes found inside a bathroom. Mr. Trump was charged with 40 criminal counts to which he's pleaded not guilty. Tonight, the former president is calling the lack of charges in the Hur report a two-tiered system of justice. But the report argues the two cases are different, and that while Mr. Trump was given multiple chances to return classified documents, he allegedly did the opposite and obstructed justice by enlisting others to destroy evidence. In contrast, the report says Mr. Biden alerted authorities. The president says he cooperated completely.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.